And today I want to address a concern that many of you have sent me comments and questions about. And this has to do with the question that are arising everywhere in the world, more than it has probably in 50 years. The question is this: we have a global economic system that has a name. It's called capitalism. It's been with us quite a while, a couple hundred years by most counts. Even though it started in Europe, it has since spread to pretty much everywhere else. And we also now have the worst economic crisis of capitalism in the lifetime of people awake and alive today. It's not the worst one yet, because that honor goes to the 1930s, which was worse than what we have so far, but we're not done with this one, and we shall see who gets the prize of being the #1 crisis before this one is over. But it's bad enough to have led people around the world to ask the question, what are alternatives to capitalism? If capitalism is producing a situation where millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world are without work who need it and want it, and that's the case. If millions are being thrown out of their home, and that's the case. If we have, side by side, hundreds of millions of people who want to work, and all the raw materials, tools, and equipment for them to work with, and we have them, and they're sitting idle, what kind of an economic system is it that can't put together the people who want and need to work with the tools, equipment, and raw materials they could work with and on to produce the wealth we all know we need because of the poverty in the societies of the world, because of the need to rebuild infrastructures to take care of our people's basic needs. We need the output, the people want to work, and we have everything they need to work with. An economic system that can't put those things together has lost its claim to our support. So people have figured that out. Not just those who are unemployed or foreclosed out of their homes, but those who live in neighborhoods where they see it around them, those who see it on the television, in the newspaper, everywhere, who see it coming to their own societies, who are worried about it because of their relatives, their friends, their neighbors, their fellow citizens. Everywhere the question is being raised, is there an alternative, and what is it? So that's what I want to spend a little time with you talking about today. To begin to have the conversation we should have been having for the last 30 or 40 years as the capitalist economy was getting itself into deeper and deeper problems, eventually exploding in the crisis of 2007 that we still live with. So let's begin. The classic way to get into this is to recognize that capitalism is a system that was born out of another system, out of people who had had it with the other system. It was born in Europe, and the system that they didn't want anymore was the one that had been dominant in Europe for 1,000 years. Feudalism, it was called. A system of manors, feudal lords and serfs, people who were stuck on the land, who were agricultural workers all their lives, who had to stay where they were born because they had no other place to go. They were the serfs of the Lord, just like their parents and grandparents had been. That system fell apart, first in Great Britain with the revolutions and the turmoil of the 17th century, and then with the great French and American revolutions in the 18th century, and so on. And out of the feudalism came a new kind of economic system, which we now call, and looking back, capitalism. And what was it about? Well, at first, it was just a protest against what had existed. Feudalism was making life impossible for the serfs. It was making the wealthy at the top so wildly wealthy that the gap between them and everybody else was intolerable. Some of you have had the chance to visit, for example, in France, and could go to Versailles, this spectacular castle and grounds outside of Paris, where the Louis this and the Louis that lived the life of the kings and queens of the time, wealthy beyond words, while the mass of people could barely get by. And if that sounds familiar, good. And that feudalism was overthrown. Revolutions happened to get rid of it and to bring in capitalism. And the most famous slogans were the French revolutionary slogans: liberty, equality, fraternity. We would bring in an economic system that didn't have lords and serfs, that just had individuals, each with a chance to make a life for himself or herself as best they could, buying and selling, what they could do, what they could make, etc. very individualistic, was against the old society of feudalism because it had been so bad for most of the people. Liberty, equality, fraternity. What inspired Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Sam Adams, and the other people who made a comparable revolution here and who looked to France, for example, and to the British as the way to go. That system, which we now call capitalism, celebrated the individual, sometimes called individualism. If only you let each individual do what he or she is good at, wants to do, what they can produce, well, then everybody pursuing their own self-interest will somehow make a society that works beautifully and makes the best happiness for the largest number. The most famous exponent of this, Adam Smith. The famous idea, if every person pursues his or her own self-interest, we will all be led as if by an invisible hand, God, to an outcome of a capitalist society that is the best possible world for us all to live in. That was the belief of the people who brought us capitalism, who helped overthrow feudalism. And their hope was the kinds of society that these wonderful slogans put forward. We're turning now to the critics. What did the critics say back in the end of the 18th, early 19th century about this new capitalism? The critics said basically that capitalism isn't producing what the people who brought it into being promised. We are not seeing in the 19th century liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yes, every individual is running around there trying to make a decent life, make a living, trying to do the best they can, yes. They're free to do that, yes. But a small number of them are doing real well, and an awful lot of them aren't. And that was not the image. That was not the plan. That was not what John Locke in England wrote so poetically about. That was not what Tom Jefferson wanted to install in the United States, and the people who found all of that inspiring had hoped for. Not at all. Across the 19th century, in one country after another, first in Europe and also in the United States, we were seeing a divide. Relatively small numbers of people doing real well, and masses of people not doing real well. So the critics began to say, capitalism isn't delivering the equality, the fraternity among people, the well-being for everybody that had been promised, and why not? Well, there were many critics, but one of them came to dominate everyone else, first in Europe and then globally. And that was Karl Marx. And his basic argument was something like this. You're not going to get fraternity, equality, and even liberty for most people under a capitalist system. What capitalism does is free up technology to develop, and it makes a lot of money possible, but it is gathered into relatively few hands, and there is your problem. And that problem is located in the core of every enterprise, wherever it's located, every capitalist enterprise. And why, Marx says? Well, it's simple. The majority of people go to work in a factory, a store, an office, and they work 8 hours a day, or in the early days of capitalism, 10 or 12 hours a day, producing the goods and services that their employer sells. When they're finished working at the end of each day, the worker, who's devoted his or her brains and muscle to making the goods or the services, goes home. The goods and services the workers produced stay at the workplace. They become the instant property of the employer who sells them. And the employer keeps the money. What the employer does with part of the money is pay the worker. And replace the tools, equipment, and raw material. So Marx said, let's look at that payment relationship between the employer and the employee. Here's the way it works, Marx argued. The employee demands, because of what the standard of living is that workers are used to, what they want, what they're in a position to get, they demand something. Let's call it, for the sake of argument, $20 an hour. The employer looks at the employee and says, okay, I am willing to pay you $20 an hour, what you want and need, you say, but only on one condition. During the hour that I'm paying you $20, your labor, your work, your brains, your muscle, have to add to the goods and services I have for sale more than $20 worth. So if you help make shirts, or you help cook hamburgers, or you help style someone's hair, the value of what you add by your labor to the other workers there has to be more than $20 so that I can pay you $20, sell it for more than $20 what you produce, and I keep the other as profits, as the net income of my business, what I'm in business to get. I'm not going to pay you what your labor is worth. If it's worth, say, $25 and I pay you $25, there's nothing for me, and I'm not going to hire you under that basis. Ah, says Marx, that's how it works. The worker produces more for the employer than he's paid. That's the condition of the work contract. And that gives the employer the profits, which the employer uses to keep himself in the position of getting that extra, what Marx called the surplus, out of every worker. And Marx argued that produces a lot of consequences. First, tension and hostility. Workers want more. They want to get closer to the value they produce. The employer says, no, 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 that squeezes my profit. The employer presses down on wages, presses down on benefits. That's what we've been seeing for the last 25 years. If the employer can go to another part of the world and pay less, he'll do it. If that leaves the worker who used to get paid better high and dry, tough. It's the way the system works. Wow. What did Marx say had to happen? He said we had to get beyond this. We had to change the organization of production. And the way to do that is to use the majority of the people, who are the majority, in societies that are democratic and have the right for people to vote. Wow, Marx said. The people are the majority. They can use the government because they control it by the majority vote. And here's what they should do. The government should take over the enterprises from the private owners and employers and treat workers differently. So one idea was we should make the society as a whole be the employer rather than these private people who are always in tension with the employees they hire. And so the name of what Marx was talking about, that he took over from others but that he really defined, was socialism rather than the individualism of capitalism. The society should organize things. The society should be the employer. In a sense, working people, through their government, should become their own employer. And the other thing that Marx was interested in was saying, you know, capitalism distributes goods and services by means of an institution called the market. And the way the market works is the goods and services go to those with the most money to pay for them. If there's not enough stuff to go around, it'll go to the people who can pay the higher prices that the seller can charge because there's more people who want it than there is material to be sold. In other words, a market distributes goods and services according to people's ability to pay. Marx argued that's not fair, that's not right, especially in a system that gives so much to relatively few and so little to the majority. Distributing according to your ability to pay rewards those who have gotten the most and punishes those who didn't, and that's not a system that a society ought to support. So instead of a market, Marx argued there should be planning, and Marxists have liked that. So socialism came to mean not the private ownership of factories, offices, and stores, not the private enterprise that we're familiar with in capitalism, but instead it should be socialized. It should be done by the government in the name of all people, who become then the government employer of everybody. And the second idea was planning by the government to distribute goods and services according to people's needs and not according to their ability to pay in a society riven by the inequalities that come out of capitalism, because the mass of people produce those surpluses and profits that a small number gather into their hands. And so we saw efforts at the beginning of the 20th century to go from capitalism to socialism. The most famous, Russia, becomes the Soviet Union. Almost as famous, China becomes the People's Republic of China. And they institute government ownership of large parts of their economy and government planning, just as the followers of Marx thought they ought to do. But here's a problem. They never changed in either of those societies, in a fundamental way across the society, the actual reality of every enterprise. What Marx began and focused on, change the way work gets done. Don't have majority of people producing a surplus, a profit that a small number of people get into their hands. Don't have, as in most corporations, many workers and 10 or 12 people on a board of directors, a dozen major shareholders, those tiny groups getting all the profits and deciding what to do with them and squeezing it out of the mass of workers with their limited wages and their limited benefit. Don't do that, Marx says. It destroys society, it breaks it apart, it divides. And that has to be changed at the base. But that was not done, neither in Russia nor in China. Not done. They took over the enterprises with the government, and they did a lot of planning. That part they did. And that had all kinds of consequences. In a later program, we'll talk about the pluses and minuses. But those societies either fell apart, Russia, Eastern Europe, or have changed dramatically, China. And they haven't been able to hold on even to what they did. So the question arises, have the problems they've had perhaps had something to do, something important to do, with not having changed, as Marx would have argued, the organization of production inside the factory, inside the office, inside the store? And the argument that's happening now is a big yes answer to that question. In other words, people now critical of capitalism think that Marx and the Marxists had a lot to say that was wrong, a lot to pay attention to, a lot to think about. But they're not so taken with the way it was interpreted, the outcomes in Russia and China and so forth. That they think had a lot of problems. Not only that it didn't change the base of society, the workplace, which Marx had emphasized, and which remained largely the same after the revolution as before. Masses of workers coming to work, doing what they're told by a small group of people, etc. And they weren't so thrilled with giving the government that much power. If the government owns all the factories and offices and stores, if the government does all the planning, you're suddenly at risk that that government has a level of economic power that may give it dictatorial political power, and then you get the lack of personal freedoms and liberties that so many people find wanting in the history of the Soviet Union, in the reality of China, and so on. So what's the place people are going to today? Well, they're saying, let's focus at the level of production. Let's go back and realize that we could and we should think and act to change the daily work life of people. Put on hold for a minute owning private public. Put on hold for a minute markets versus other mechanisms. Those are important debates. We should return to them. But the place we ought to focus is the place we neglected so badly over the last 150 years, in capitalism and in those countries that call themselves socialist or communist. And that means thinking about changing the organization of production so that it isn't coming together of composed alternative oppositional players. Let's not have workers versus employers. And the way to do that is to have workers be their own employers. To transform from the top-down hierarchical capitalist model of an enterprise to the cooperative, self-governing, democratically run enterprise, where the workers themselves democratically decide what to do. In a future program, I'm going to come back and talk about socialism, communism as alternatives that are different from one that's focused on transforming the enterprise. Learning that the problems of capitalism today may be solved better and sooner if we make those kinds of changes at the base than if we don't. And whether or not you agree here isn't the point. The point is, we should have been debating this question for the last 50 years. Our economic system shouldn't get a free pass from public debate and criticism. We criticize our schools, we criticize our medical care system, we criticize our transportation system, and that's good. That's how you keep a society healthy. You question and debate its systems. You figure out if you can do better, you figure out if you can fix them. We should have been doing that for capitalism, but we were afraid to. But the Cold War that made us afraid is over. It's been over for 20 plus years. For God's sake, Americans and everybody else, let's resume the conversation that should never have stopped. Let's talk about capitalism's strengths and weaknesses. Let's face up to them, look at the alternatives, and then make a reasoned decision of where we go next, especially now when this lingering crisis, now in its 6th year, makes that urgent for the vast majority of the people of this world. As you know, as a service to do this kind of conversation and to move it forward, at this point in the program, we often do a description, a brief description, of a workplace that has already done what we're talking about. It's already decided on the ground, with people's feet, with their lives, to organize their work activity in a different way. And we do this because we want to stress that cooperative, collective, democratic, self-governing enterprises are not some idea that is going to come in the long distant future, some utopian dream, but is a reality. Inside the United States, outside the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, all over. People are doing that and have been doing it for a long time. And we also want to get over the idea that it can only be in certain kinds of industries or can only be small. And we therefore devote our time to picking big examples and small examples. Agriculture, industry, goods and services. And so to show it's all possible, it's all already there. Today we're going to talk about a group of 12 people. They're located in Viroqua in Vernon County of Wisconsin, a state in the United States. These 12 people are all what we call here mental health professionals. They help people with all kinds of problems. Drug problems, alcohol problems, family relationship problems, anxiety problems, all the things that go under the big, broad heading of mental health. Their outfit is called Center Point Counseling Services, a workers' cooperative. They've been going there for a few years, very successful. It's a decision by 12 professionals in this area that the best way to serve their community in the way of mental health counseling is by doing it as a workers' cooperative. And rather than me describing it, I'm going to give you a few quotations from their own writing about what they do and why they do it, so you can hear in their words why these working people believe in and support this kind of work organization. So I'm going to read now. Our cooperative does not require an expensive and complicated layer of management. We manage ourselves. We not only own the practice, but we experience a sense of ownership, facilitated uniquely when the individuals providing the labor are also the owners. We are therefore all financially, emotionally, professionally, ethically, literally invested in this practice. Cooperatives, they continue, are the only business models built on a set of principles, a set of 7 goals and priorities other than generating income. Yes, we need to plan for financial stability, but in addition to reasonable and predicted financial goals for our business and ourselves, we also are committed to the central tenets of cooperatives to serve our community. These principles are free and open membership of all the people we serve. They are members of our activity. Autonomy and independence. Education all the time to inform everybody about what we're doing. Training people to participate as much as they can. Cooperation among the other co-ops in the community and concern for everybody's welfare. Wow. And they mean it, and their description of their work does. One more quotation to read from you to get a feeling not just of what they do, but the spirit with which they do it. We are not, I'm reading again, we are not just labor, although we are the people who provide the services. And we are not management, but we do manage and own the business, making every last one of the decisions of this business together and democratically. We are, in fact, members in a workers' cooperative. We manage ourselves, we own it, we provide the labor. Very interesting success story, a mental health counseling service, 12 people working in a cooperative way in Viroqua, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Wisconsin. Now to the final section of our program each week, where I deal with one of your questions, two if we have the time. This one came in recently and goes like this. How do you address the issue of competition in capitalist production systems? And how would it work if we reorganize production in the sense of workers running their own businesses, what we like to call workers' self-directed enterprises? And sometimes we use the abbreviation WSDE to say it quickly. Good question. Here's the difference between competition among capitalist enterprises and competition among cooperative enterprises. Cooperatives in the sense of worker cooperatives or producer cooperatives. First, competition in capitalism. Pretty well known. Every capitalist enterprise, unless it can erect a monopoly wall around itself, which many try and some succeed at, but accepting those, majority of enterprises in capitalism are always worried that someone will come up and outcompete them, an existing enterprise or perhaps a new one, who will come up with a way to make the same product more cheaply, to make the same product more attractive, and to steal their customers. So there's a constant pressure among capitalist enterprises because for them, competition is both a chance to make a real killing and make a lot of money if you can outcompete the others, but at the same time, a terrible threat that if somebody else outcompetes you, you're dead. And indeed, the history of capitalist enterprises shows competition can and usually is ruthless. If not right away, then over the long run. And here's what I mean. If one company producing something can do so through a competitive struggle for a better technology, for more efficiency, for better workers, for a more glitzy advertising campaign, whatever it is. But if one company can make its products more attractive than another company making the same thing, the company that is successful at that wins the customers. It therefore makes a lot more money, it can grow, it can expand, it can spend more on advertising, it can buy the more efficient latest technological breakthrough. But by contrast, the company that isn't able to do those things, that didn't come up with a good advertising gambit, that didn't find a cheaper group of workers in some far-off country so it could drop the price of what it sells and wipe out the competitor, the company in capitalism that is outcompeted typically, sooner or later, dies. It collapses. It goes into bankruptcy. It has to sell its tools and equipment as part of bankruptcy. And its workers have to look for work elsewhere because it fires them. And who do you think buys the used equipment at a song of a price? And who do you think is the first place that the workers who lose their job go? Why, to the other company that won the competition. The competitor not only destroys the companies he outcompetes, he literally eats them up. He absorbs them. And that is why the history of capitalism is the history of competitive enterprises, an industry in which there are many companies competing, over time becomes fewer and fewer and fewer because the winners eat the losers. We once had in the 1940s and 50s in the United States dozens of automobile companies. Now we have 2. We once had huge numbers of cigarette companies. Now we have 3 or 4. We used to have large, fill in the blank. It's true for virtually every industry. Capitalism is thereby ruthless. And capitalism has a built-in tendency to negate itself, to undercut itself, to go from competition to monopoly. That's why it's always been so strange to hear people say who don't like monopoly, big businesses that control everything, whatever they are, in whatever industry. It's always been funny when people say we should go back to competition. Very nice idea, but it's competition that got us monopoly. And if we don't want the same thing to happen again, we would have to, here we go, change the capitalist system in a fundamental way. Well, then how would competition be different if enterprises were organized by co-ops, workers who ran their own business and who organized the economy in conjunction with other co-ops in the cooperative spirit? The answer would be simple. Of course we would have competition. We want companies to become more efficient. We want companies to become better able to produce more output with less labor for human beings, to free us up to have the less labor lives that all technology has promised and so rarely delivered. And the way to do that is to say the company that does better, that produces a better mousetrap, a better haircut, a better hamburger, should grow. And it should, if needed, absorb the workers from another industry. We can work that out. And if there aren't enough jobs for those others, and if we want to keep competition, then we make sure that there are rules providing jobs for the people who don't lose their job out of any failure of their own. In the normal course of figuring out better ways to do things, some jobs are not needed anymore. And maybe everybody can work a little less because we don't need so many people, since the competitively advanced company figured out a way to do the output with less workers. In other words, we cooperatively solve the problem of unemployment and of suffering so that we get the competitive result we want, advance of technology, advance of freedom from drudgery, but without the costs of monopolies that take advantage of us and unemployed people when there aren't enough jobs for the folks laid off with the uncompetitive company. And in case you're wondering, do we have an example of where that works? Yes. That famous company in the north of Spain that I've talked to you about, Mondragon, with over 100,000 workers. That's how they've been working very successfully for decades. They press each company to be competitively advanced, to advance its technology, to become better. But they make sure that those people no longer needed to do a kind of work because somebody else has done it better, find other jobs in their system. There's always work to be done. There's always useful things to do. There's no excuse for unemployed resources and unemployed people. Last word on this. To understand the difference between competition capitalist style and competition cooperative style, think of the difference between the star on the team and the team effort. Do we want everyone on the team to excel in his or her role on the team? Yes. But we don't want them to do it without understanding that it's the team in the end that makes the economy work. We don't want one company to be successful, leaving in its wake the disaster of destroyed people and community and jobs. Not necessary, not useful, not what we want. We want a team effort. We want the cooperation that allows us to get the benefits of competition without paying the awful price of monopolization, of lost jobs and lives that capitalism has imposed on us as if it were the only way to have competition. You don't need capitalism to have competition. Thank you for being with me today. I look forward to talking with you again next week. This is Economic Update. I'm Richard Wolff. Thanks very much for joining me.